Thick oil or thin oil? Hi, I'm Lake, the motor oil geek. Let's compare the friction and wear of a 20W-50 to a 5W-20. Wait, you don't think we're going to use this, do you? No. To get real results, we need a real engine. So let's go to the dyno and get some answers. To get that real data, we needed a real dyno and a really special engine, which is why I flew all the way from North Carolina to Lake Havasu City. Here we are at EFI University.
Yeah. Welcome, guys.
This is my best buddy, Ben, by the way.
We do have a lot of fun together testing real engines.
Yes.
And getting real data. We have an engine on the dyno, so of course we're measuring the power output of the engine, but we've also outfitted this engine specifically with individual sensors that are drilled and placed through the cylinder head into the combustion chamber. So we can measure the real cylinder pressure while the engine's running. Now what's cool about that is since we know cylinder pressure, we know the bore, the stroke, we can calculate out exactly how much power and torque the engine makes inside the cylinders.
Yeah.
Now, that's basically like what you get for your gross pay on your paycheck.
Right.
And after all the friction and windage losses and oil losses from the engine, what comes out to the dyno is your take-home pay, your net. So we measure both the gross power production and the net power production. Now, we've done this before.
Yes.
And what we often find is that we make changes like to the oiling system, and the gross power stays pretty much the same. So when the net power changes, we know that that's the effect of whatever we did with our oiling system. So now we're going to test it again this week.
Yeah, so it gives us the perfect opportunity to isolate the friction of the engine between that 5W-20 and 20W-50 oil. We're going to be able to know exactly how much friction contribution there was to the engine by doing that.
This is really exciting. How often do you get to test stuff just like that?
It's so cool, right? I wish we'd had this years ago.
This thing is more of a race engine with 2618, like really tough alloy pistons. This thing has aluminum connecting rods, not steel rods, right? So there's a lot of differences in this engine to a standard engine that you might drive around on the street, not just from clearances and tolerances, but from the actual materials as well.
Even the oiling system's quite different. In its normal configuration, there's a supercharger hanging over here.
That's right. Yeah.
This engine can make 1,300 horsepower.
Yeah, or more.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Now, when you do that, it definitely wants a thicker oil.
Sure, so you need more protection, right?
Yeah, we don't really know what we're going to see. So we're going to run that 520, then we're going to run the 2050, like we already talked about. But in a previous video, people question whether or not there's validity to pre-filling the oil filter.
Right, and we do a lot of oil changes when you're doing this kind of testing.
Right, because one of the questions was, well, is there a measurable difference, right? So theoretically, yes, you get oil pressure faster when you pre-fill the filter than if you don't. We will pre-fill the filter and we'll basically crank the engine like 5 times in a row and we'll take an oil sample.
Yep.
Then we're gonna put 5 dry filters on it in a row and crank it, and we'll measure the time it takes to get oil pressure, and we'll take another oil sample so we can see, is there a measurable difference in wear? Because the used oil analysis is gonna be how we determine the wear in the engine. So after everything we do, be it a cold start, hot temperature start, 8,000 RPM run, we're gonna do oil samples, and we'll have oil samples from the 520 and the 2050. So in the end, we'll know what the friction is from combustion analysis. Oil analysis is going to tell us what the wear is, and in the end, we'll give you all the results.
It's really cool because, doing this kind of testing, we all have our own ideas and opinions of what we think is going to happen.
Right.
But, just doing one set of tests on the dyno this week answers a million questions, and getting one data set like that's worth all the opinions in the world. So I'm not even going to tell you what I think is going to happen.
Right.
We're gonna sit back and do the testing and let the engine tell us what the truth is.
Well, anyone who watches this channel already knows we're all about science instead of speculation on this channel. So we're gonna let all the oil drain out overnight. We'll refill it tomorrow morning with fresh 5W-20, take a 0-hour sample, and then get started.
Sounds like fun. Let's do it.
Good morning, it's day 2. So we let the oil drain overnight. So we want to make sure we got all the old oil out. We normally run this engine on leaded fuel. So what we did yesterday was you warmed it up, ran it on unleaded fuel, put fresh oil in it, and we let it drain out overnight to try to get as much of that old oil out as possible. When we refill it with the 520 here in a minute, we're gonna take a 0-hour sample. We're gonna use that as our reference of where it began and then build from there. Because there's gonna be stuff in here. This engine's got like 138 dyno runs on it, so there's stuff in here. You're not gonna get it all the way out and have it spot perfectly clean. So the 0-hour sample will be our basis as we begin to move forward with the testing. Also, it's going to let the engine be, normalized room temperature. So we'll do the same thing tomorrow morning when we begin the test with the 20W-50. That way, the oil temperature, the engine temperature, we're beginning from room temperature at both times. That way we're giving them an even, fair test. All right, let's start putting some 5W-20 in. In case you're wondering why we keep mentioning about this leaded fuel thing, with the leaded fuel, on the oil analysis, it will hide if there's any bearing wear. This engine has bushing lifters, and the lifter bores are bushed, so there's gonna be copper. Well, if you have leaded fuel and you have a lot of copper components that are in the engine, then you're gonna have normal copper and lead showing up in the oil analysis. Well, the problem is bearings are also made of copper, tin, and lead. So it's very easy to hide a bearing wear issue in an engine like this when you're running leaded fuel and you have so much copper in it. That's why it's important with this test that we make sure that we're running unleaded fuel so we can actually see if there's any bearing wear going on running the thinner oil, or if the thicker oil causes a problem. We just don't know yet. We're gonna run, we'll find out, but we gotta put more oil in here first. All right, so you got 5 quarts of oil in the oil pan. 6 quarts gonna go in the filter. I know, that's controversial. Some people think we should, some people think we shouldn't. We're gonna do it anyway. We're gonna test it both ways, and then we'll see the results. You know what? I gotta be a person that will live by what I say. If the data shows that it was useless, then okay, I'm good with that. But we're gonna let the data show it, because I don't really care about speculations or opinions. We're gonna let the data show us which one works best. So let's go ahead and pre-fill the filter for this first test, and then we'll do the other ones without pre-filling it. And like we said, the data will tell us in the end whether or not it makes a difference. But we're gonna find out. All right, engine is filled with 520, so now it's time to take our 0-hour sample of the oil. All right, we've got our 0-hour sample. Time to get started with the real testing.
Okay guys, so here's the scenario. We're ready to test, and now the test we want to see is how long does it take us to get stabilized oil pressure. So remember, on an LS engine, the oil pump runs off the crankshaft at engine speed. So we'll start the engine, and I'm going to start my stopwatch at exactly the same time I hit the starter. We're going to see how long it takes from when you would turn the key on your engine to when you would actually get stabilized oil pressure. So it's going to rise up, and it's going to stabilize and kind of plateau there, and then we'll stop the clock and we'll see what it takes us. Okay, so we kind of saw what we expected there with the oil change happening. That first little bit of time after we start the engine, we're going to have low or maybe even no oil pressure. So in this case, it took us just a tick over 6 seconds between when I touched the starter button, the engine cranked for a while, started up, and it came to its idle, and our oil pressure stabilized there. So what we're going to do now is see if every subsequent startup has the same 6-second delay, or if that gets shorter as we go along. Hopefully it gets shorter, but for now that's what we know. Okay, so as we suspected, after that first initial startup where the oil filter got all the oil through the lines and the block is filled with oil, after that, subsequent startups, it only takes about 1.5 to 2 seconds and we're good to go with our oil pressure there. So that's to be expected, I think. It might be a little different if we do the not filled oil filter, but the only way we're gonna find out is to go in there and do it. So let's go.
All right, the pre-filled filter is off. Now it's time to put a brand new, right out of the box, filter on the engine. You're gonna watch me, even though you know it hurts my heart to do this. Here is a filter, unfilled. We're gonna put it on there. Put a little drop of oil. Okay, empty filter, number 1 on the engine. Okay, I know this part is gonna be massively controversial. We can't just add clean oil to the engine because that would dilute the results. So the only way we can do this in a fair fashion is to pour the oil from the filter back in the engine. Now, hear me out. This is a full flow filter. There's not a bypass in this system. This is a dark block. There's no bypass system in the block. And there's no bypass in this filter. So 100% of the oil goes through the filter. So all we're doing is taking the oil that was in the filter and we're gonna put it in the oil pan, which will go through the oil pump and then back through the filter. So just know that we know what we're doing when we're doing this. We understand it isn't ideal, but there isn't any other way to do this. So just know that. I know it's gonna be painful to watch this, but yeah, here it goes. It's gonna happen. It is a clean drain pan, by the way. We did clean it out, very clear. And it's going through a filter. Don't forget that. All right, let's fire it up, see how long it takes to get oil pressure.
Okay, so we're back to do the second test now. Now, this time we have the oil filter that has not been pre-filled. Now, I suspect we're gonna see a similar trend to the last test where the first cranking or the first startup, it's probably gonna take a significant period of time. The oil's gotta go through the pickup in the pan, into the pump, out of the pump, from the pump, filling up that filter, and then all the lines have to go in there and do all that stuff. So I got a pretty fair idea that it's going to take a while to get that full. But then after that, I suspect probably won't take nearly as long on all the subsequent startups. But you know what? I got my stopwatch here ready. I'm going to hit start and the starter button at the same time. We're going to see how long it takes us to get oil pressure in there. So I think we're about ready to go. So here we go. Fuel pump is on. Exhaust system is on. Here we go. In 1, 2, 3. Looking for our oil pressure here, comes up and stabilized. Okay, so if I'm being honest, it didn't take dramatically longer. I mean, I missed the switch there for just a second. That probably cost us half a second or so, but I'm at 7.27, let's call it 7.3. You know, if you take a half a second away for what I missed, I'm gonna say it was arguably a half a second longer with the filter empty versus the filter full. So as we do this a few more times, I bet we're gonna see the same thing we saw before, which is now that our lines and filter and everything is completely full, probably not that big of a deal.
Okay, so we've done our primed filter versus unprimed filter startup test. So now I take the last sample from this round of unfilled filters. That's tough to say, it's like a tongue twister, unfilled filter. Say that 3 times fast. So anyway, take the sample now of the post unfilled filter test. Then we're gonna get onto our power test. Take a sample. Nice and cold, which is nice. Not gonna burn our hands. Can't say that about later. We've done all the startup testing, pre-filled, not pre-filled.
Yep.
That was interesting.
It was. There was a couple of times when I thought I knew it was gonna happen and that's not what happened. So
right.
That was kind of cool.
I really can't wait to see the oil analysis results from this one.
That will tell the story. You know, I mean, all we've ever heard is the most damage to the engine always happens during startup. So
absolutely.
I would say we did a fair amount of abuse to this thing if that's true.
Yeah, so that's why we're not really gonna do a lot of dyno runs because once the engine's up and running, it's not really gonna wear that much. There's more wear at startup than there is at running. So we'll run through the dyno sweeps and do that to be able to know what the friction is, but we don't really need to do that for the wear because I think we probably, like you said, we just did the worst to it just then.
Disprove that. What's actually worse for the engine, running it hard or starting it dry and cold? Let's find out. Yeah, so we've gained almost 40 degrees.
Okay, 12 power runs down. Time for the final sample. All right, we're gonna let it drain overnight. Fortunately, my friend Ben isn't just a dyno nerd. He also happens to be a very experienced pilot and certified flight instructor. And my son, Benjamin, is here, and he's also a pilot. So guess what we're gonna go do? We're gonna go fly while this thing's draining out. So not only did we let the oil drain overnight, we also put 2 quarts of oil in the fridge overnight because, you know, oil gets thinner as it gets hotter, but inversely, it gets thicker as it gets colder. I thought just for a little bit of fun, let's do a cold flow test because Project Farm on YouTube, they have a really cool video series. They do a lot of stuff with oil. And one of the things that they do that I really like is that they do that cold flow test. Well, we're not gonna be as precise as what they're doing, but just for fun, let's see the difference in pour between a 520 and a 2050 just sitting at refrigerator temperature overnight. Let's see that difference in pour. We have our 0-hour sample. Time to get started.
All right, we're back. We got a good night's sleep while we were waiting for all the oil to drain out of the block so we could be fair. And you got the 5W-20 weight out, and we got the 20W-50 back in. Now, you've already done a bunch of stuff. You did your pour test, you got your 0-hour sample, like we're ready to go. And we pretty much have what we think is like worst case scenario, right? So,
right, yesterday we kind of began with the best case scenario. We had a lighter oil, pre-filled the filter, and we knew it took around like 6-something seconds for it to actually reach oil pressure and stabilize.
Yeah, I would say all the tests we did yesterday were somewhere between like 5.7 to 6.2 seconds. I think 6 seconds is a real good benchmark.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things where we've been going back and forth, and I don't want to use the term arguing, but discussing like, man, there's a million variables that could actually affect this. So is the filter full? Is the filter not full? Is it thick oil or thin oil? So you did your pour test.
Right.
And there's a big difference between just pouring it out and our G-rotor style pump pushing it out.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So
API does not use a pour test to determine the winter grade.
Yeah. So
it's a cold cranking, and they use pumping at low temperature because that 20W-50 is very different than that 5W-20. That number before the W is not weight.
Yeah,
that's right. The winter cold cranking ability, and we won't explain that now. I'll leave a link below for the video where we go and explain all that because it's way too much detail.
Yeah, a little complicated, but it's one of those things where like we both have a whole bunch of ideas and opinions, and we're thinking about all the variables.
Right.
Like, how fast does that thicker oil drain out of the passages in the block? You know,
yeah.
And so
clearances. This is not a tight clearance. This is not a modern, production engine. Right.
Yeah, this is a loose racing type engine, but it's one of those things that the easiest way to get the answer is testing. They say one test is worth 1,000 opinions, and we got lots of them. So instead of doing that, well, let's just go test this thing.
Let's find out.
All right, well, we're all set up. We're going to do the same thing as yesterday. I'm going to press the start on my timer, and I'm going to press the starter button at the same time. Now, as soon as it starts, and I let go of the starter button, I'm going to be watching here for the oil pressure. It's probably going to come up, and then as soon as it comes up and stabilizes, I'll hit the button. We'll see what we got. No pressure, right? So I'm going to do that on 3, 2, 1. Okay. So it was about 1.5 seconds longer that time. Interesting. Same as yesterday, 5.6. But it did have the huge, so that happens every time we have the empty filter, doesn't it? That's freaking rad, dude. 1. 3, 2, 1. Came right up. So that run is already 1, 2, 3. It's the 4th run, and it's already as high as it was yesterday after the 12th run. Making more power as the oil gets thinner.
You see this dip in oil pressure? Starts off, does pretty good, then it drops down. The reason for that is this is a giant 11-quart oil pan. It's flat on the bottom, and these cylinder heads actually don't flow back that well. It can hold a lot of oil in the valve train. This dip is the volume of oil in the oil pan dropping, because that positive displacement pump is pushing all that oil up to the valve train, and it's not draining back down, which you see that drop. We can fix that just by adding more oil, and it will basically help stabilize that. But there's a price to pay for that. We're going to put in 3 more quarts of oil, so we're still 1 quart shy of how much we could put in the pan, and let's see what happens.
Okay, we're ready. We're going to run this thing with 10 quarts of oil in it, and we'll compare how much power it makes to the old runs. Okay. Yeah, buddy. So you can really see the oil pressure was killer through the run. Nothing else changed tune-up wise, but boy, oh boy, at higher RPM, you can see it just keeps getting lower and lower the higher you go as you pay more price for that windage.
Wow.
How much fun was that?
That was amazingly cool. There was a hidden nugget here that I did not see coming a mile away.
Okay.
But we're gonna save that. So let's kind of recap the data here real quick. Going with the 520 to start off with, this engine is incredibly sensitive to windage.
Yeah. Well, and you think about why that is, it's a wet sump oil system, all right? And so that's already a big detractor.
Right.
But this one in particular had a little longer stroke in it, and it's got big old fat aluminum rods, right? And so the problem with the big old fat aluminum rods, they solve all kinds of issues, but they bring a whole new set of issues with them too, and that is effectively cross-sectional area. The big end of the connecting rod in an aluminum rod has to be physically larger than its equal counterpart in a steel rod.
Right.
Just because it needs that strength, right? Yeah. And so while you gain some weight savings, you get a lot more stuff flinging around in the oil pan.
Yeah.
So in this case, because of those large connecting rods, there's a lot more opportunity for them to get hit by oil draining back down in the engine.
Yeah.
So it's more sensitive to it.
Yeah. Fancy way of saying between that and the big giant flat bottom oil pan.
Right.
This probably wasn't the greatest oiling system to use to do this test.
So let's see. Maybe you shouldn't use a circle track style oiling system on a drag race style engine, right? Like
probably so. You know, put it this way, when we hook up a dry sump to this one day, we'll repeat the test and we'll get completely different results. I'm quite certain.
I would almost be willing to bet.
The reality is, with this engine configured the way it did, because of that, the windage losses were really significant.
Yes. Yeah.
With the increase in oil flow from the lower viscosity oil. We did see a 5 horsepower reduction in power with the 520. From the first pull to the 12th pull, it lost 5 horsepower.
Now that's 5 average, right? Like, so all the way everywhere across the run. But let's make sure we help everybody understand why, right? So every time you made a run, we logged the tune-up, the combustion analysis let us know that the power is not changing because you guys are doing anything in the tune-up. The power is changing for some other reason, right? So the dyno's over here going, hey, it's making different power as you go up. But what we could see is the oil temperature was changing. Every time we did a run, that oil temperature got a little hotter, a little hotter, a little hotter, which of course tends to thin it out.
Right, viscosity is going down, which means oil flow is increasing.
That's right.
So those windage losses were increasing, which is exactly what we saw.
Well, as the oil was getting thinner and thinner, that pressure relief valve is closing to try to keep the oil pressure constant, which means now we had to put more volume of oil into the block. And if you put more into the block, you get more raining down from the block into the oil pan, which in this case is not so helpful if you have these big giant aluminum connecting rods.
Right. Yeah. Long way of saying big windage losses as the oil got thinner, as it got hotter, which is what you'd expect it to do. Now, when we put in the 20W-50, now we didn't have anywhere near as much windage loss. So you would expect the engine to be way down in power with the thick oil.
Yeah, that's right. You would.
Which the first run is exactly what we saw.
Yep. It was what, about 20 horsepower difference?
Yeah, about 20 horsepower.
That's a huge number for changing oil.
So,
imagine doing an oil change and losing a race.
I mean, 20 is huge. But that goes back to, why do the modern OEMs put in low viscosity oil?
Yeah.
It's because there's that huge gain right off the go.
Yep.
As the oils both got hotter,
things started to change a little bit.
they did.
As that thick oil initially got thinner and thinner and thinner, the disadvantage of the thin oil was that, man, we just got so much windage, it was starting to hurt us. But the thick oil that started out kind of hurting us started to not hurt us so much.
They started to catch up,
Yeah, by the time we got done, we did 12 runs on each, and by the time we got done, they were pretty stinking close.
Yeah, it's still, 3 or 4 horsepower advantage to the thinner oil.
Sure, but that's not that bad.
No. So I think it was, so the thick oil gained almost 20 horsepower.
Yeah.
From the first to the last run.
Yeah, everywhere. Not just like, oh, one little bump, like it's, all the way up. Your curves look pretty similar.
Whereas the thin oil, it lost 5 from the first to the last. So it's kind of crazy, but it goes to show it depends upon what your engine is and how you operate it.
Sure.
Determines what the right viscosity is.
Yeah, so you spend all this time telling people you got to have the right oil in the right place at the right time and the right amount. Well, how do you know what's right? Well, a lot of it depends on what are you going to do with the engine. Because the same engine in 2 different circumstances might want a different oil.
Right. I keep hearing this guy in my head saying application dictates chemistry. I don't know.
Been saying that a while, and it's finally coming to fruition.
Yeah, it kind of works.
This was a really fun project getting to do with you because it's one of those things where dyno testing can be really frustrating, right? Because sometimes the power changes and you're like, but I didn't do anything. Like, what happened? And so having not only a consistent engine to test with and a consistent dyno to test with, but having the in-cylinder pressure combustion analysis really allowed us to zero in and say, I can guarantee you it wasn't the tune-up that made this power change, because we could see the difference between how much power it was making inside the engine and then all the frictional losses when it got to what the dyno was measuring. So when you could lay those runs on top of each other and say, man, it made within like a half a horsepower, it was the same, but yet the dyno showed me, 5 or 18 or 20 differences. All of a sudden we had this ability to learn what was actually causing the problem. And so that was really rewarding to see, after 24 dyno pulls, to really see the difference.
And of course, to verify it, we added in
So let's dump 3 extra quarts in and see what happens. And you know what happens?
power.
Murdered the power.
Just like before.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So it didn't matter what viscosity it was, because that was even a heavier viscosity,
Yeah.
and it murdered it just as much.
Yeah, you couldn't make up for all that oil raining down on the engine with just viscosity, right?
No.
Like it's just hurts you every time. So not having enough oil is really bad, but having too much oil, that's not so great either.
No, that Goldilocks and the Three Bears thing, balance is kind of the key in life,
Yeah,
right?
just right is just right.
Yeah.
So
that's the friction part. We saved the very best for last. I'm sorry, I made you wait so long to get the part that you probably care about the most, which is the wear.
Yep, but it was worth it.
This is totally worth it. So, oil filter people, I'm going to tell you one last time, pre-fill your oil filter.
Oh, you're gonna have some hate mail now.
Oh yeah, but we have facts, right? Not just how much time it takes, because we definitely saw a difference in the rise in oil pressure.
Yep.
There was not a giant difference in the amount of time when it hit the peak of pressure.
Initially. Like the initial spike, yeah.
But there was this really weird blip, this burp that was going on every time we did not pre-fill the filter.
Right. So initially the pump had whatever was in the pump kind of squirts into the system and kind of compressed all that air that's in the filter. But as soon as that air pocket moved out of the filter into the oil pressure system, yes, it initially started and got to the same pressure. But when you didn't pre-fill the filter, it would trail right back off, and you'd have some lower oil pressure that you did not see when you pre-filled the filter.
Right. And then when the oil analysis showed, back to that air pocket, is that when we did not pre-fill the oil filter, we got water in the oil.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. So we did it both ways, right?
Yeah.
Pre-filled, not pre-filled.
Yeah.
And once you ran it without being pre-filled once, somehow or another, it sucked water into the oil, and then it stayed in the oil until we finally got the oil hot enough and it evaporated out.
But that's not just something that like your opinion or you feel is what's happening. That's what actually happened.
Right, we did it twice.
Like literally sent the oil to a lab, they had it analyzed, and it came back and was like, wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, that's the one I did not see coming. Other thing about the viscosity difference is that on the video about pre-filling the filter was, well, does it really make a difference in terms of wear? Does that momentarily...
Is it really doing anything?
Right, because we're talking about, you could say we're splitting hairs in terms of this time difference and this little bump and that, and okay, the water, that's a neat little anomaly.
Yep.
But is there any significance to that presence of water? I don't know. But I can tell you this, the 5W-20, it mattered if you pre-filled the filter or not.
In actual wear.
In measured wear. So when we did not pre-fill the filter, there was an increase in wear, and it was positive for water. When we pre-filled the filter with the 520, there wasn't a change in wear between those samples. But the 2050, shock of all shocks, it didn't care what you did.
Interesting. Only the thin oil really made a huge difference.
Right.
Isn't that cool?
Well, it's back to the viscosity, lower viscosity. It flows easier.
Higher flow. Yeah,
right?
easier to get it there.
It literally flowed off all the bearings. Like, for example, we went from 13 parts per million iron to 61 parts per million iron when we made the power runs with the lower viscosity oil.
Keep in mind, that's quadruple the wear.
That's a lot. Compared to the 2050, where it went from 11 to 21 parts per million iron.
Yeah, which is still doubling.
It's still doubling.
Right? But it's not quadrupling.
No.
Twice as much wear on the lower viscosity.
And on the lead, it goes from 30 parts per million to 41 parts per million with the 520.
Now, wait a minute. Where would that lead come from, Lake?
Oh, it was not from the fuel. I worked extra hard to make sure we flushed the system.
Yep.
And we had our 0-hour samples to reference that from. So it 100% came from the bearings.
Unfortunately, that's the only place you're going to find lead in one of these engines if it ain't in the fuel.
Yeah, it was from the bearings. And we know that because when we ran the 2050, there was no change with the 2050.
Yeah, interesting, huh?
It didn't have that increase in wear. Because, okay, there is a difference in pre-filling the filter if you're using a low viscosity oil, which 520 is pretty common these days. I mean, my daughter's car that started this whole thing, 0W8.
Yeah, so that's pretty thin oil. I mean, that's like water.
Right, you got 0.8, 0.12 that are coming on the market now.
Yeah.
So 0.16, 0.20 seems thick now.
Yeah. Well, and 5W-20 might as well be, you know.
2050.
Yeah. Putting that in our semis now.
Yeah, you know, so not only was there a big difference in how the engine responded horsepower-wise to the change in the two viscosities, there was a big change in wear.
And that's one of those things, like, look, I can forgive a little bit of power loss, you know, whatever. That day I don't get to drive as fast. But boy, if you're using up your engine, that means the overall comes a lot sooner than it would have otherwise, just from something really simple like pre-filling your filter.
Right, so pre-filling the filter does make a difference, especially when you have a lower viscosity oil.
Sure.
If you got your old school hot rod and you run 2050 in there, I guess it doesn't really matter. The data said it didn't care.
As much as we would like it to matter, it doesn't. The data doesn't care what we think or what we want or how we feel about it. The reality is the damage was much more visible when we were running a low viscosity oil.
Absolutely. That's the simple fact. The low viscosity oil made more horsepower, but it actually had more wear, especially when you didn't pre-fill the oil filter. Those are all the facts. You've seen it. We showed you every step of the process. We hid nothing. Whether you like it or not, the data doesn't lie.
Yep.
So I can't thank you enough, Ben, for letting us come in and do all this crazy, wild testing.
We did a lot of dyno runs, and it was a heck of a lot of fun. I'm glad you came and did it with me.
We filled that Home Depot paint bucket full of oil filters. That was the worst thing. I'm never doing that again.
Yeah.
Don't ask for some variation of this test.
No, it was miserable, wasn't it?
That was
hot
horrible.
Oil and, yeah,
Horrible. Oil everywhere. But we will come back. We will put a dry sump on it.
I promise we'll do that.
And we'll show you the results.